got levels. This one's all I'm doing. This episode is all you're gonna have to carry this one.
I was kind of hoping, at least like Jack will come and do some of the work, all of the work. At least maybe he'll direct it. Maybe what normally happens is that Jack kind of directs, and I mean, as the listener knows, Jack collects some quotes, has some things to say about those quotes, and then sort of hopes that by reading the quote it will. Well, I suppose I hope that it will trigger in me some kind of process of just like being able to articulate.
That's in an ideal world.
Yeah. I feel like any reasonable podcast, really, what one would do, what we would do, would be like actually have some kind of division of labour, work out in advance, like who was perhaps feeling comfortable talking on what topics. But I'm so terrified of the prospect of actually committing to being able to talk on any specific thing, come up with any particular collection of words in the right order at any required moment, kind of thing. I much more enjoy just letting it all hang on chance. See what will happen.
There's going to be a lot of chance this week.
I mean, it's unfortunate, really, because last week's one, what I realised after last week was just a bit like we can only represent it to the extent that we're able. So long as we're not revealed to be like totally incapable of representing it in any way possible, then I'm sure it'll be fine. But I think we've got our work out this week. We might actually be in danger of just like
this week's
totally
going to be so
failing
good
to represent. I've gone back and forth as to whether maybe we'll do some preamble before we get into it. But I've gone back and forth onto whether I how I feel about this sort of text. I was reading it and getting very angry, and then I had a thought which I then decided was unreasonable on my sort of my midweek kind of like second reading, kind of like getting a bit more into it was just a bit kind of like, oh, this is okay. We can just take it at face value. I don't have to judge it based on other things that I've been reading. And now I've flipped right back towards just being furious with it. And I told myself, and then I told myself, I sort of made a declaration to myself that I thought I might share, and then thought, when I was being more favourable, that's probably a bit harsh, but now I've decided I do mean it, which is let's never choose a reading because we feel like we probably ought to read it.
That's a good idea. That's a very good idea, which is why this week we're reading State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. My experience with reading it was, I would say, very similar to yours, but I kind of reread it. I went through it once, and when I got to the halfway point, I was like, this is pretty good. And then I read the latter half, and I was just kind of like, but I think that's just because I don't really have any idea.
Is it something about French and the way French is translated that necessitates that exactly 1/3 of the text needs to be written in brackets
or italicized?
I mean, I don't necessarily mind italics. The problem is there is a diversity of punctuation that one can use. Your asides and your parentheses don't need to all be in brackets, particularly when the content of those brackets normally is actually part of the sentence for the most part.
I know.
It's just an excuse to extend a 2-line sentence over 3 paragraphs by putting most of it in brackets.
There's a lot of extending going on in this book. There was a lot of, or not in this essay, a lot of. I will explain this, but first I have 2 theses. To get to my other 2 theses, I will explain this one, and then like 30 pages later, it gets to the first.
I mean, I've only just noticed that it has a subtitle: "Notes Toward an Investigation."
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's annoying, isn't it, that we now have to I just realised that I have to be. I mean, the same with like the Miliband, where we're always like, it's an introductory book. I mean, obviously we look favourably on that book anyway, but like also there is this constant kind of like, it's an introductory book. It's from 1977, and we have to say that this also is kind of like notes toward an investigation. And I suppose we could have just read a whole book.
But here's the thing: I don't know if he wrote a whole book about this. I could have looked that up, but this was published as an essay, and so while it has that title, like I feel like it's a bit of a cop out because it's like just for him to just regurgitate everything onto the page and be like, what? So it lack of structure. So what? It's notes. It's like, yeah, but you published this in an academic like thing. Published this in a whatever. I wasn't sure because like I was trying to just now, just before we started, I was just trying to work out like, does this deserve to be like
like an text kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
is like people do talk about this. I mean, we've not even introduced the podcast yet.
I was going to say
we haven't checked in with each other. We haven't
We'll
even said what
we
it
haven't
is
even
that we're reading.
No one has any idea what we're talking
I mean,
about.
clearly, I think we both had a lot of. We just wanted to vent.
We just wanted to get into it. So 3 things. First of all, hello, welcome. This is Auxiliary Statements. I'm Jack.
I'm done.
The second thing was what we're reading this week is Louis Althusser's, we're just going to call him Al, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation. And the third thing was, I forget. Doesn't really matter because it wasn't important.
How am I? How are you?
That was the third thing. It was. How are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, good job.
I think I'm good. Yeah.
Right,
Aside from like some residual fury, which is ebbing
Sure,
now.
sure.
It's ebbing away.
Mm.
It's been a bit of a non-week, so I don't really have much to update you on.
Sure.
We planted some broad beans in the garden last weekend.
Oh, did
so
you?
Now we've got 2 crops of broad beans potentially.
Were they aqua dulce broad beans? Because if they weren't,
they would. I think they're dwarf broad beans.
oh, interesting. Were they autumn sowing?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Where'd you get them from?
We went to the garden centre, which is must be the same one that you went to.
Is it in blue?
The one all the way. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I was
I like
thinking
it up
about you
there.
as we were driving up there. I was thinking about you presumably walking on the way there.
there.
You did say pilgrimage last weekend.
It was a pilgrimage.
Last week rather. And
Well, and I was going to walk back. That was my plan. But I had a bag of manure, and I was like, I'm just going to get the bus. Forget it. I got my mask. I'm getting on the bus. First time I've been
got
on a bus in a
with your
while.
bag of manure.
With the bag of manure, yeah.
Fully rotted manure.
Fully rotted manure. And yes, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah.
If you're, it's also kind of a non-week for me. I think the winter time changes, as we say every week, but this week I mean it. It's getting on my nerves.
Yeah. I now can't get back from home and go into the garden for even 5 minutes and see any sunshine kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like it's already set when I'm getting back, and I do quite a short day. So anybody who finishes at 5 o'clock, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, today was a weird today. Today the sky's cleared just long enough to see the sun go down.
Yeah, I know.
Which was nice, but also a little galling.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. Hopefully it will be nicer tomorrow.
Yes.
And today it was weird. I left the house this morning, and the world was very quiet.
It was.
There
I've noticed.
Cars on
Last
the road.
night,
I was just trying to work out did somebody
do something?
Is there something that I'm supposed to know?
I know. Last night and today, very quiet. Very, very quiet. I looked at the time that the sun is going to set on the solstice or whatever, and it's just like 3:30. And it's just like
But it's only like 3 weeks away now.
Yes.
From our perspective.
3 or 4,
Almost.
yeah.
Three
Yeah.
and a bit.
Yes, beans, time, the things we go over every week.
Time.
Yes.
It made me think today though. We really should have in our episode, Jack Zipes fantasy. We really should have talked about zombies. Because I don't know.
I thought you were going to say Jack and the Beanstalk.
No.
He does talk about that.
No. It was just like the world is really quiet. It's quite nice and peaceful. How nice it would be if there was some kind of apocalypse.
Every once in a while I'm like, it would be kind of nice if there was some sort of apocalypse. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Maybe episode 100 will be at the apocalypse.
Yeah, okay.
But it'll be an environmental apocalypse.
Yeah. A really boring.
Sad, depressing, as opposed to like a fun one.
Yeah.
Would you rather have an alien apocalypse or zombie apocalypse?
I think I'd be quite hurt if the aliens showed up and they were like really malicious.
Yeah.
I'd be a
Exterminatus.
bit like, oh.
They're like, sorry.
Yeah. I suppose unless they had a good reason for
They
exterminating
might.
us.
They might.
Whereas zombies, like, I've heard it said, it's not my thesis, that the reason why people kind of like zombie apocalypses is that, like, it reduces the world back down to, like, a scale, like, it's me and my friends.
Who are these people?
Who are
The
they?
reason why people like zombie apocalypses.
Oh, no, but, no, sorry, okay. What I mean is, why people enjoy television and movies.
Sure.
Which have that kind of apocalypse in it. Or rather, seek to represent an apocalypse that has the preface zombie.
It's because it brings us all down.
Well, it kind of like, I think it gets rid of a certain alienation, and it posits that like you and your sort of like small group of friends are of worth, and everybody else in the world is kind of a mindless automata, and
Interesting.
and kind of like, I mean, obviously, they always portray it in such a way that like all of the human beings of the world are really awful and horrible, and obviously, one does not want to face the threat of being eaten by a zombie.
Sure. Who would?
But like banding together with your friends in a solidaristic way, and like facing down a small quantity of adversity, and like having to build a sort of like community that's not necessarily capitalistic in nature. Like,
I think we could.
There is something that it's trying to strike at, I think.
Sure.
Perhaps not like The Walking Dead or something.
Maybe you are a cultural theorist after all.
Who knows?
I think we would do all right in terms of
the.
Yeah. I think we would do all right in terms of the society building, in terms of the
you mean
broad bean
general,
growing.
Or you and I?
No, you and I.
Okay.
In terms of broad bean growing.
Sure, yeah.
There's plenty of protein in broad beans, I've heard.
Whoever told you that?
Yeah, I don't know. Could have been a fool.
Very wise.
Yeah, so that was our broad bean update for the week.
Yeah, a weather update.
Weather update. It is still cold. It is still dark. And we hope you enjoyed last week's episode. We're going back to Ralph Miliband. Sneak preview of this week's episode. Dan doesn't know this, but we will be going back to a little bit of Ralph Miliband this week as well, which is exciting. About my cheeky little Ralph Miliband book.
Yeah. Because we're worried we're not going to be able to represent this very well, or explain this very well, or understand it.
So that's the thing.
We'll have to fall back on somebody we do understand.
Can we preface this really quickly by going back to the intellectuals conversation from last week and kind of adding on to it in a way? And let me preface it by saying this. Preface the preface. You hear a lot, and we discussed this in our Jack Sipes episode, I think, where it was like the role of Marxist cultural theorists versus the role of like more hard science Marxists, right? I guess like, economists or like political science nerds or something like that. They're all nerds. But when I get a little frustrated when you hear quibbling between academics, because it's like the academics, first of all, it's off-putting entirely. Let me just say that to all of you, to the cultural theorists, to the economists, to the political guys, to the Lenin cap guys. It's all off-putting to just like a normal person. Nobody cares about like the inner squabbling. And also like the only time that like the differences between like, like minor differences between like, guys who are like economic determinists versus guys who like, oh, once you have the revolution, you have to do this. Like the little kind of like what I might consider like kind of more minor differences in like leftist discourse between like Marxists and stuff. The only time any of that matters is when you actually have power. So it's very frustrating to me, I think, seeing academics who are Marxists you kind of be a little full of themselves and kind of like squabble a lot and kind of be a little pedantic and be a little like full of themselves, but too big for their britches. There's a lot of that going on, I think, in this week's reading, and I think that that's one of the reasons that it was kind of off-putting, is because whenever I see Marxism written about in a very like froofy kind of like holier than thou, I'm smarter than you kind of way, and really trying to put forward that like academic verbiage and like long paragraphs full of like, you know, like you were saying, the like parentheses and stuff like that, I find it very off-putting because that's not going to convince anybody to follow their best interests. And by anybody, I mean the people we should be trying to convince, we might call the working class, or just like normal people, you know what I mean? So I think that that was the main reason I had a problem with this, and I think that it also could be that I'm an idiot. Discuss.
Not mutually exclusive.
Not mutually exclusive. Exactly. But yes, Louis Althusser's Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses Notes Towards an Investigation. There are parentheses in the title. As Dan said, text on ideology, kind of one of those drop-down menus. I want to be a Marxist. I want to read something. Give me something to read. They suggest do this.
Yeah. That's the sense that I get. It seems to be on like university syllabuses and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I was expecting it to be more like complete, I suppose. If I'd been given that as a student to read, I was baffled.
I think students probably get like fragments of it, which makes sense. I think it probably makes sense.
Yeah. I can definitely think of some lucid fragments.
Yes.
In otherwise
Indeed.
chaotic text.
It is chaotic.
But it's difficult.
Else.
Like, I flip back and forth because there's a certain extent to which his style and his attitude is one that we would kind of condone to a certain extent. Like it's sort of like making a statement and then giving the lots of addendums and sort of like sort of poking holes, but he never kind of fills the holes kind of thing. You sometimes feel like you're being a bit gaslit that you don't really know what he is that he's actually saying. Like he'll say one paragraph and then he'll contradict it with the next one, and then promise you some kind of like synthesis of the contradiction, some kind of explanation, at some point later in the text, and it never really seems to come.
Yes.
I found myself struggling because there is an endearing way in which he writes, which is very kind of like, this is just a sort of gesture toward a thing, and I don't really know, and this requires more thought, and he speaks in the first person, and he says I quite a lot, and I don't know. There's something about that way which makes me feel inclined favorably toward him, and then I read a little bit more, and I just become infuriated again.
Yeah, well, it's the dissonance, and I think that's what's so frustrating, because he's kind of trying to have this like, oh yes, I understand that I am an academic and that I am one of the smartest people in France, of course, but then it's like. So it's very off-putting. I found it very alienating trying to read what are kind of relatively simple concepts, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Like, this is the problem. It felt like really what you were trying to do is parse quite a small number of very sort of simplistic descriptions, sort of dressed up as something that's meant to be more profound kind of thing. And then you come away either feeling like, I'm an idiot for not understanding this, or I'm an idiot because what I've taken away is some things that were actually really obvious. It can't possibly be this can't be what I'm supposed to take away from this, because the things that it is saying seem relatively obvious. And also you're so infuriated you really want to struggle to poke holes in it and criticize it, and at the same time really all you're getting is some things that are to some extent self-evident. I'm not really sure. There is a sort of stylistic difference between this and something like the Ellen Mixon's Wood or the Ralph Miliband, in that, like, particularly Meekson's Wood, she just gives you a solid thesis, but it's all sort of prefaced on a huge number of like examples kind of thing. It kind of feels like she starts with the sort of complex granular detail and sort of like synthesizes some kind of answer, whereas it kind of feels like Althusser works the other way around, and that he sort of like starts with these quite grand proclamations that are quite abstract, and then kind of makes some effort to flesh them out. But there's so often in this one, it's like, oh, one example will do kind of thing, or like, this is kind of self-evident, so I'm not really going to explain it in any great detail kind of thing. I miss the readings where you get like, I don't know, like 10 examples of a thing, and it's all sort of all like,
well, they were definitely written to be understood. Miliband and Meekson's Wood were like really making an effort to just like some schmuck like me be able to read it and go, oh, I understand what Marx was trying to say, it has real value for me in my life. Meekson's Wood did a great job of explaining why you should know the real history of how capitalism came into being, and not just being like, look at me, I understand how capitalism was formed, and all these other people are so wrong. I mean, she does do that, but like, she also makes it pertinent to you. This one was very much like, I read Marx, I understood it. It was so complicated, but I managed to parse it, and here's what I gained.
Yeah, I mean, I have a suspicion that what he thinks he's doing, and maybe it is what he's doing. I mean, every time that I end up being really sort of gesturing towards like my skepticism, it might be based on my ignorance, similar to what you said.
Similar to what I said.
I mean, like, if some Althusser scholar wants to come and correct us, like, it's quite all right. I don't mind. I think he probably thinks that he's doing something very similar to what Marx's attitude is, right? Like, in Capital, Marx starts with a whole series of abstractions, and then sort of like applies them afterwards, kind of thing. And it is very much. So I don't necessarily want to criticize that strategy in and of itself, but in this instance, at least in these 40 pages or what have you, of a notes toward whatever the you don't necessarily get it.
I stand by what I said last week. I think this guy was an anarchist.
Sì, sono tutto d'accordo. Io sono anarchista sociale. Non sono comunista, perché l'anarchismo sociale è al di là del comunismo.
And I did send Dan a video where he was like, I'm an anarchist.
Did he say he was an anarchist?
Or he more or less did.
Was he just sort of like...
He's like, io sono un anarchista.
Elucidating the sort of like historic similarities. He was sort of explaining...
He was doing that.
How the division between communists and anarchists came about, or Marxists and anarchists. And,
Pretty classic if you take that route of reasoning, which he does, which is, I think, more or less like pretty accurate for the most part, where he basically says like the split obviously came with like Marx and McCunin. Classic. Classic. It was just these two pricks. It's just awesome.
Yeah.
Two large men with big bushy beards and large egos. Well, should we dive in? Should we go for it?
Why not?
Why not? Why not? So the main point.
That's ostensibly what we're here for.
That is, doing something like that. We're really only doing this episode because we want the Althusser hashtag. We want to get all those SoundCloud freaks. Althusser wave.
Better be a popular. Yeah. I woke up at it was maybe it was Saturday over Sunday last week. I woke up at 4:00 in the morning. I think I was waking from a nightmare, but also a cat may have woken me up. And also I think there's a possibility someone was letting off fireworks at 4:00 in the morning.
All right.
Not really quite sure why. One of your cats, maybe. And as I was laying there trying to get back to sleep, I had this realization that Instagram functions on hashtags.
Oh.
And so then I had to go back and add hashtags to all the several posts I'd put on Instagram.
Good hashtags, though. Very good hashtags. You do the hashtag whenever we do something Miliband related.
I'm just going to put Miliband. I just decided to put Ralph Miliband on every
post I put. Good point. Good idea. You put Ralph Miliband is the best Miliband.
Yeah,
I put, because I'm on SoundCloud, I put Miliband Wave. I got some, nice. Some good vibes.
Good.
All right, Althusser, what's he doing here? So ostensibly the point of this whole essay, and like we said, it's about 60 pages, at least in the edition I have. He is making the point, at least in the beginning, that a lot of Marxists around the time he was writing, which was 1969 and 1970, focused a lot on how the means of production reproduce themselves and how our economic modes reproduce themselves, but not so much about how our social relations reproduce themselves. And so to him, that all comes down to ideology, but his definition of ideology is it's very broad, and it's very, well, not, maybe broad's not the right word, but he ties a lot of stuff into it, and it doesn't just mean like God save the queen, you know what I mean? And it's not just like this idea of like God bless the nation state, all of this stuff. So yeah, he parses the material implications of ideology as well as kind of like the philosophical implications of what it means to have an ideology. And obviously he ties ideology into class. And yes, I did think it was very, very interesting reading the bits about him tying ideology into a material existence, where he kind of says that, like, maybe I was wrong about this, maybe I misread it, but he was kind of saying that like an early Marx might kind of make the distinction of ideology, Marx and Engels, as being like this kind of like imaginary kind of thing that doesn't have a real material base in your mind, and it's just like, oh, you just think these things because like the goddamn church, dude, like whatever, man, my boss. But like he says, no, ideology has material base, right?
Yeah, it's basically the same as what we were saying last week about the early Marx thinking that capitalism was just going to remove a lot of illusions, kind of thing.
Yeah.
In a similar way, yeah, he makes this analogy between ideology and Marx and how dreams were considered pre and post Freud.
Sure.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that bit? Because I didn't really understand that. By all means, Dan. Explain Freud's career.
I mean, only to the extent that pre-Freud and I suppose pre-Marx or in the early Marx, dreams and also at the same time the illusionary sort of fake I don't know illusory nature of
sure.
Ideology were sort of considered to be well, maybe dreams is the better example, kind of just abstracted, a sort of random collection of ideas kind of thing, like a certain working of the brain kind of thing, but didn't actually have any particular meaning or sort of relationship to sort of the subjectivity of the human being who was doing dreaming, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
So, I mean, I suppose there are some ways to think of dreams where it's just a kind of like processing of the day's events kind of thing, which does have some material bearing. But obviously sort of Freud came along and sort of like wanted to read into behind the sort of like substance appearance of the dream. Freud had this question of like, so what processes in the brain are collecting these collection of elements together and creating this representation? I think that makes sense.
Sure.
So if I remember my sort of Freud terminology correctly, kind of thing, there's this process of what he calls the dream work. There is a work going on which is presenting you with the context substance of the dream. So he wanted to dig a bit deeper and say, like, so why are you representing these elements in these ways? What kind of activity is happening on your unconscious, which is putting pieces together in this particular arrangement? I mean, and that's Freud's understanding of the unconscious in its entirety, I think, and to a certain extent. Well, and Lacan's taking from Freud that the unconscious is like if conscious thinking is like loads of elements connected by a sort of logical process kind of thing, like the unconscious is all of the elements, but they're sort of like reaccumulated and reconnected in different ways, and so that's why they sort of throw up all these sort of like particular peculiarities and the like. But here he starts off with maybe the early Marx or the pre-Marx presenting ideology as a kind of purely a sort of like non-logical kind of random assemblage of things, sort of mistaken ideas kind of thing. And I suppose the sort of materiality that he's trying to put into the concept of ideology is quite similar to what Freud is trying to put into the dream, in that like the surface appearance of the dream has a sort of material underbearing it, I suppose, in the sense that like,
or at least there's something else going on.
There are reasonable, rational connections between these things that are causing this appearance, kind of thing.
Gotcha.
But I'm just guessing.
Well, let's hope that was true. No, that all makes sense. That totally makes sense, because when he basically at one point says, nobody before Freud had any idea about this, and I was like, what really? I was like, expand on that, but that's just because I'm an idiot. So that leads us nicely, I think, into our first quote, where he talks about, it's about midway through, where he's talking about the material base of ideology. He says, the individual in question behaves in such a way, adopts such and such a practical attitude, and, what is more, participates in certain regular practices, which are those of the ideological apparatus, on which depend the ideas which he has in all consciousness freely chosen as a subject. Jesus, thought that sentence would end a lot earlier. If he believes in God, he goes to church to attend mass, kneels, prays, confesses, does penance, and then there's a long parentheses, whatever, and naturally repents, and so on. If he believes in duty, he will have the corresponding attitudes inscribed in ritual practices according to the correct principles. If he believes in justice, he will submit unconditionally to the rules of law and may even protest when they are violated, sign petitions, take part in demonstrations, etc., etc. So he's basically saying that, you can point to certain practices that people do that have their base in ideology, and what's more, he believes that ideology is like a class-bound set of principles, right? Or at least kind of like maybe like the dominant ideologies of the time, which is hard to kind of parse. Again, I feel like I've used the word parse like 3 times in this show. But it's interesting because I understand that. I understand where he's coming from with all of that. But the later bits were just after that he kind of starts to talk about like, bro, like, have you ever like shaken somebody's hand? Like, what's the deal with that? Is that wild? Like, why do we even do that, dude? There are a couple of
famous example of his that I think gets quoted a lot, and I thought it would be clearer what it meant. I think was the thing about like the policeman shouting "Hey you," and the person, the culprit, the person who is most guilty in the crowd turning because they're sort of like. They're constructed in their guilt by the gesture that is made by the policeman, kind of thing. Yeah. Maybe even the policeman doesn't know who he's gesturing toward, but the gesture still sort of like has its effect, kind of thing.
That's a smart way to be a cop. Yeah. Hey, you.
Just going around shouting, "Hey, you!"
Yes, you're under arrest. What did you think then of like the bits where he was, because he kind of uses that example of like when you see someone in the street and you go, "Oh, hello, Bobby," and you shake Bobby's hand. He's like, the act of shaking someone's hand, the act of being like, hello, acknowledging their existence. That's like the ideological, like socially acceptable way of like acknowledging someone's existence and being happy that you see them and acknowledging them, and then you're on your way. You do that little ritual, and that's a little bit of ideology for him. What do you think of the idea where he was like, you can't think of what I'm saying, because he spends this whole essay being like, it's all class-bound ideology, all that's to do with the ruling class, blah, 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 blah. But then he kind of pivots and says, but don't think in a future socialist society that there wouldn't be ideology, because without ideology, things would get kind of wild. What do you think of that?
I don't remember hearing that quote. I don't think in it as a gut reaction I have any objection to the idea that like socialism, communism, post-capitalism, whatever you end up with, our imagined
utopia
would be ideology free if it is the fact that in your broadest definition of ideology, basically all you mean is social convention, ways of behaving, just general rules that govern your relationship to the world, or like various norms and that kind of thing. And I mean, like it all has a resonance with me when it comes to like how the subject in certain strands of psychoanalysis is imagined, kind of thing, like or in any type of philosophy, I suppose. Just like you're conditioned by your environment, and there's that interesting example which might as well be lifted from Lacan, which is kind of like there's a little while where he's distinguishing between the individuals and subjects, presumably individuals being the kind of like raw material, and subjects being how the human being exists post their insertion into ideology once they've sort of like come to represent a certain collection of ideas, which would be their ideology, kind of thing. But he uses this example. So he introduces that distinction, and then a little while later he sort of actually says, well, there is no individual before subjectivity. All individuals are subjects, and the example he uses is the kind of like, even when you're born into, I mean, what Lacan would call like a signifying chain, like a connection of signifiers. Like you have a name, and you have, by virtue of the fact that you have a name and you have a sort of imagined future, you also have a place in the world even before you're born into it, kind of thing. And because you have parents, you sort of have your parents' name, and sort of like and then you're sort of like, I suppose you're sort of like given your sort of parents, supposing that your parents are religious, maybe you're sort of given some religious significance, or like some ritual is conveyed upon you to sort of institute you into a religion before you even have any possibility of like considering these things. And I suppose you can expand that example to however many different ways in which like human children, even before they're born, are imagined and constructed, and how the society exists in such a way that like it's
a very gnarly way of describing baptism. Very gnarly. Freaks me out a little bit. Were you baptized? No. Me neither. No. My brother was, but I was not.
Okay, that's what happened in the meantime.
A revelation, I guess. A revelation. The holy water actually burned when it hit my brother's head, so they were like, okay, maybe we won't do this.
Maybe it's not fair.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think they were just kind of like, you did it once.
They just took one look at you and like,
yeah, exactly.
Unholy child,
unholy beast. Put him away.
Anyway, I'm my parents thoroughly atheistic kind of thing.
I'm guessing your brother was not.
My
baptized.
brother also not baptized.
Interesting. I don't like the idea of doing one and not the other, just as like a controlled experiment, seeing what happens.
You're the control group.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Maybe I should have been baptized.
So how are you both doing?
Maybe I should have been baptized. We'll say that. Yes, baptisms. This is somewhere in the middle of being anti and pro Baptist podcast. Yeah. Baptist? I mean baptism. Baptist? Yeah, cool. Why not?
Yeah, whatever. So
we're back. Yeah. Should we make the distinction that he makes between RSAs and ISAs? Should we go there? Or do you have anything else you want to add to that?
What is there to say more about ideology? Basically, this text is separated into two halves, and the second half is all talking about ideology.
Yes.
And
a bit more philosophical.
The first half is, in a gradually, increasingly philosophical way, and then with a sort of notion thrown in right at the end, which is sort of like meant to overturn the whole thing, I think. I'll explain that in a minute. Sure. And then the first half is more direct, includes discussion of the state and the capitalist mode of production and its reproduction.
More in like a classically Marxist kind of sense, although he's reacting to that.
So I mean, from an ideal, I'm sort of pleased that we've started with the ideology stuff, because it's the bit that I don't understand as well, so we can get it out of the way.
Let's move on. Looks like we've covered that.
Maybe you were hoping we could just sort of fall back on the first half, the more political, the more sort of like historical,
that was
the more
my
sort of state-centered bit that we have a bit more familiarity.
Peek behind the curtain. Now let's get to the stuff. Hopefully, we can say more about.
I mean, I suppose that structure of ideology that he's giving us is predicated on this notion which he suggests that ideology doesn't have a history, by which I think he means that he wants to find the kind of like the nature of all ideologies. He wants to find something specific about human thought, kind of thing.
That seems like a huge undertaking. When he said that, he was like, I plan on putting forward this thesis. I was like, here we go. It's like, all right.
Yeah, you believe that, you believe anything. Like, exactly. 2 paragraphs down, it's like, I've said all I can possibly say about this at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, I need a smoke.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that's what you just imagine. This is a series of lectures where he sort of like goes out for a cigarette occasionally, or like loses his train of thought. Or...
Before I get to those 3 theses, let me get to this one thesis about those
maybe
4.
This might be like a sort of like the sort of like the literary text equivalent of editing a podcast. You're just cobbling together the most rational bits that people.
Yeah, at least you didn't like write in like throat clearings or pauses. Or dot 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 dot.
So what are we saying? So
the state.
No.
We're talking about the state. Let's go. Okay, we're talking about the state. Parse for us this theory of the history of ideology.
I need a smoke.
I don't know how you say that in French, but I get the feeling you said it a lot.
I like this idea. From what I understand of the thrust of the argument, I suppose now. He suggests that subjects are interpolated by
I was confused
ideology.
By that. Okay.
By which I think I mean that.
Wow.
By which I think he means. By which I think he means that like it's sort of interpolation is a kind of a certain amount of filling in of blanks. I think in mathematics it's a kind of like filling in the blanks in you sort of look at a sequence of things and you sort of fill in spaces in between, kind of thing.
Sure.
So it's a degree of, I suppose it's a degree of construction, but I suppose it's gesturing toward a type of work that ideology does, which is sort of incomplete perhaps, or like an active process of sort of like constructing and
sure.
I don't know. So the state.
I was gonna say my notes end on
maybe we can come back
49.
to it. Maybe we can come back to it.
We'll come back to the ideology. It'll come up. So the state. Let us start this off by returning to our old friend Ralph Miliband. Because if you remember from last week's episode, Ralph Miliband in a sentence basically just threw this whole essay aside. Not the whole essay, but like the whole bit about calling RSAs and ISAs, which we'll explain. Putting the S in there as kind of silly. So RSAs and ISAs. I think we kind of went into this last week, but just to recap, RSAs, repressive state apparatuses, those are the things that enforce the will of the state. Those are the military, cops, border patrol, things like that. You know, makes sense. Security agencies, I suppose. Although they might actually kind of flop. And then there are ISAs, ideological state apparatuses, which are the things that impose the ideology of the state, right? So those, okay, so yeah, we said this last week, but those are the things like the family unit, media, all these different things, schools, which he gets into a lot and we'll talk about. But he explains, I'll put forward both arguments and we'll get to which one we like more. Because Althusser in this likes to, he says that he knows what you're thinking when he calls ideological state apparatuses. You might look at the family values, you might look at the media and be like, those are obviously not part of the state. So he says, we can ignore that first observation for the moment, but someone is bound to question the second, asking me by what right I regard as ideological state apparatuses, institutions which for the most part do not possess public status, but are quite simply private institutions. As a conscious Marxist, Gramsci already forestalled this objection in one sentence, which is funny because Miliband forestalls his objection to that in one sentence as well. The distinction between the public and the private is a distinction internal to bourgeois law and valid to the subordinate domains in which bourgeois law exercises its authority. The domain of the state escapes it because the latter is above the law. The state, which is the state of the ruling class, is neither public nor private. On the contrary, it is the precondition for any distinction between public and private. Let me do a quick book swap here. Go to, page 57 in this one. So basically, what's he saying there? He's basically just saying that the state is part of bourgeois society, so are all of these other things, right? And that, back off, don't at me. That's why I'm calling them ISAs.
Yeah, I mean, he's speaking. I suppose we talked a little bit about structuralism last week.
Sure.
I don't even know whether I can give a very good definition of what.
It's about structures.
Exactly that is. But it's about structures.
Well done.
And has the potential to be quite rigid. And I think if the sort of like this is not really a historical description of the state or the mode of production or notions like that. It's not the same kind of historical analysis you get from Ellen Mixon's Wood. Well, sure. You wouldn't necessarily expect that because Louis Althusser is a philosopher and Mixon's Wood is actually a historian kind of thing. Uh-huh. But for someone like Wood and to some extent Miliband, like different. Take something like the transition from feudalism to capitalism, right, and then the continued development of capitalism up into the point where we now live in this world where there are supposedly apparatuses of the state that take responsibility for repression and apparatuses which take responsibility for ideological indoctrination. There is, and we believe, and they would both contest that. There was a fixed transition that happened between one mode of production and another, and they were sort of like there is a qualitative difference between the two.
Sure.
But that said, like all of these developments from one to the other happen in a very gradual way. Things are advanced more than others. Certain things, certain structures of feudalism only need to be changed in such a way that they're compatible with capitalism. It's not that every aspect of it has to be overturned in its entirety kind of thing. So you're always going to get these sort of like cultural and social and institutional outliers which are sort of like still reminiscent of feudalism or still bear the hallmarks of this historical process that's happening.
Sure.
And Althusser, to his credit, doesn't necessarily not sort of like gesture toward that idea. But you do also get the sense in which he's really trying to speak of the specificity of capitalism in a way which doesn't really recognize the sort of like asymmetrical development of capitalism from feudalism in various different ways, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Like in a historical analysis, you get. I mean, I always keep using the word granular, but like
we're gonna parse these granular
I don't
details.
know. Yeah. Some kind. It feels like more of a fine, detailed analysis of events, kind of of
Sure.
developments. Whereas so much of what you seem to be getting from Althusser is like a description of the structure of capitalism, which is kind of like totemic, all-encompassing.
All dominating.
Dominating.
Yeah.
And so it's in that kind of context that you I mean, I don't necessarily. I mean, we don't get enough of the Gramsci quote to really.
Yeah. Well, we didn't need to. It was one
to really actually have enough to say what we are able to think about Gramsci,
Yeah.
and to some extent that sentence has some appeal.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Totally. Of course.
And I think we would be really worthwhile sort of like in future or now or the listener thinking about the idea that certain distinctions that we're told are as significant, something like the distinction between the public and the private, might be a bourgeois distinction kind of thing.
Sure.
But that said, that the notion that like what Althusser is trying to read into that statement, I suppose, and what that statement is trying to communicate, it is that there is this sort of solid whole of capitalism. Its ideological structure is sort of like permeates everything and is everywhere, and you are thoroughly in it.
Yeah.
In a way which what Jack's about to say about quoting from Miliband has a lot more sort of like historic specific detail in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see what you'd like to say.
Absolutely. So I'll read two sentences. One, which is exactly what you were getting at, where he says, when he's kind of talking about the structural and the kind of like granular detail, right? He says that these statements do not really actually contradict each other. They simply reflect different and contradictory facets of a complex reality, in which the opposing forces of tradition and actuality on one hand, and of change on the other, do battle for the consciousness of the working class. But the sentence that he uses to directly criticize Louis is, calling all of these state ideological apparatuses is based on, or at least produces, a confusion between class power and state power, a distinction which it is important not to blur. So, I mean, I do have to wonder, if you were to confront Althusser on this, if he would kind of back down a little bit and be like, it's just nuts, bro. Like, chill out. Like obviously, if you're going to take that approach,
to
you're
some
right.
extent, this is, I mean, what is happening here is sort of what you were describing from the beginning, right? Like, I suppose all distinctions can be blown out of proportion to the extent where people are taking up arms to defend one side or other, and so that's why that first Miliband quote is quite nice, where it's like,
relax,
we can all be friends. Yeah, relax, bro. Like,
Big Ten.
and like it's almost like a difference in focus.
Sure.
Althusser sort of spends 90% of his time sort of like presenting a sort of structure and analysis, which I suppose is right, and then spends 10% of the time sort of alluding to these other things that are going on. But his focus is much more on the structural side, whereas like Miliband's perhaps much more on the sort of like historical kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly when Miliband is calling for this sort of historical analysis where you look at the state as divorced from class kind of thing and try and work out what the historic relationship is between those two.
Or at least a little bit more specific on what you're saying, not necessarily entirely.
But there's an extent to which like Miliband glossed over a lot, because it's hard not to. I mean, Althusser presents a kind of Marxist analysis of the state, which basically just says that the state is thoroughly capitalist bourgeois kind of thing. It's an arm of class power and class oppression, and it's responsible for reinforcing capitalist norms, and also takes the response. But I mean, the sort of the overarching, or the starting point anyway, of this whole first half of this essay is basically sort of talking about how the capitalist society reproduces itself. I think you said some of this before.
Sure.
And this focus that's happened on how does capitalism reproduce its sort of physical substance, like how does it produce more inputs, more commodities that go into the production process to make other commodities kind of thing. So yeah, how does it reproduce the factories? How does it reproduce the sort of material inputs into the productive process? And to some extent, how does it reproduce the workers, right? Like how much money are they paid as a wage kind of thing?
The historical variable minimum.
But I really quite liked that. Addendum was quite good, because because there is this confusion in Marxism where it's like the wages of workers always tends to be what the minimum is to maintain them. Well, here's a good example of Althusser like gesturing toward a historic process, right? Like it's not that workers are paid only the bare minimum. It is a sort of historically specific amount of money, and it comes about through various historical means, but particularly through class struggle. Right?
Exactly.
It's the result of workers and capitalists like struggling from pushing and pulling towards whatever the accepted amount is at any one given time, kind of thing.
He does my favorite little tiny Marx quote there, where he's like, Marx was like, for example, the historical minimum in England is beer for the workers, and in France it's wine. It's like, oh, okay. The workers need drinks, everybody.
So yeah, where were we at? What were we saying?
I don't know. I think I was just going to add on one more thing, which is that I really do kind of I think appreciate both approaches, and I think both are necessary to have and both are necessary to study. But I think if it's like, okay, why are we reading these texts? Why do we want to know any of this? Why are we studying them? It's to interpret the world so we can change it, right? And it's like, what's going to be more useful? This like telling everybody, bro, like these big structures, like you don't even try, dude, because it's like they're just so overpowering. And the media, dude, it's like it's all the bourgeoisie, dude. It's just like whatever. Become an anarchist like me. I'm Louis Althusser. Just kidding. But or the
become a Stalinist like me.
Exactly. Or the I'm
I used
not
to be
going to call
very
it.
defensive about. I said this last week, didn't I? I won't repeat myself. I said this last week. I used to be very defensive of Althusser, and people would suggest
Sure.
that he was basically just a crypto Stalinist. But yeah, I think
I think he's a crypto anarchist, so whatever. But yeah, or like I hesitate to call it the Miliband approach, but like the historical approach, what we've seen in the Wood reading and the Miliband reading, which is this: no, if you actually want to interpret the world to change it, you can't fall prey to these just big overarching like it's all the bourgeoisie, right?
Yeah.
Like, you really need to understand your enemy, I suppose, right? Because you need to be able to see its weak points, see what it actually is, because that's how you're going to change things. If you go into a fight thinking that your enemy is something different than what it is, you're going to mis-strategize and misinterpret everything, I suppose.
It's very hard to work out how this is meant to be of serious practical use.
Sure.
I mean, except for like purveying bong grip takes, I suppose, or like,
bong grip takes galore in this.
or like, yeah, I don't know.
What was in that pipe, Althusser?
It's funny, isn't it? Like he describes, he clearly thinks, and he speaks in a kind of like pseudo-scientific way.
Yeah.
I don't know whether like there is a sort of neutral use of the term pseudoscience, or there's like a pejorative use of the term pseudoscience,
yes.
and I don't know which of those it is that he is engaged in. But there's so much of it's like, here is the theory so far. There's a bit where he's trying. He constantly he keeps saying, but the theory that I advanced so far is purely descriptive, and then he'll say something more, and he's like, but this is still partially descriptive, kind of thing. And descriptive in this case seems to mean that like, here's my theory, I'm applying it to reality. Here are my examples of how it corresponds to reality. But it's still only descriptive because you haven't added any new theory on top. He always wants to, which given the title that we've chosen for our podcast, kind of thing, that was never properly explained. Maybe we'll explain it a bit better one day. We're meant to be all about like supplements, just every kind of thing.
Love a good supplement.
So this and so maybe there is something about the sort of the gesture towards science that he's making, which we can appreciate, at least in a sort of like terms of social science kind of thing, and we're not getting to debate as to whether like Marxism is a hard science in and of itself.
Here we go. But
there is it does sort of feel like his focus is always to add more theory, regardless of whether. What answer he always wants to add theory, even though there isn't anything to answer necessarily. That's sort of what it feels like anyway. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Because I mean, clearly the addendums that he's making are necessary to some extent. Like, adding the idea of a giving name to these structures which purvey ideology, but they're not directly repressive. Is fair enough, I suppose, kind of thing. And I suppose his idea is if you add more theory, then it can lead to a better description. And I suppose then perhaps he thinks that he's given us a better description. So I suppose that is kind of the gesture that he's making toward development of practical thought and use, kind of thing.
Sure.
But it doesn't. You don't feel particularly illuminated.
Yeah.
By the reading of it necessarily.
There's a lot of theory going on. Well, let's get into some of the stuff where the theory is actually useful. I think that when he talks about when he kind of goes into parse the granular details of what some of these ISAs are, where he goes in specifically to talk about some of them. There's some that he didn't talk about because he makes a big list about what the ISAs are in his belief, and some of them he doesn't talk about.
Trade union ISAs,
he doesn't talk about that. Anyway, but he does talk quite a bit about schools, right?
Yeah, I mean it's annoying. This is the kind of like, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
This is the heights of the kind of bong grippery kind of thing. Where it's like it's kind of like, whoa, man, have you ever realised that like the school day and the work day are sort of like similarly structured?
Yeah, no kidding.
Maybe it's what I'm.
No kidding.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But it's like, a bit of that where it sort of feels like, you're just being descriptive, like in the guise of like adding some kind of useful theory. But maybe it's not like...
Yeah. I mean, I think it is useful if you're trying to explain to someone about like someone who doesn't really maybe have any kind of Marxist background, trying to explain to them.
Sure, yeah, and maybe this is why sort of like the concepts of the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus are used as kind of introductory concepts. That's why they are taught in, I don't know what kind of departments at universities they're taught in, literary departments, I suppose. Our old bugbears, philosophy, yeah. And then maybe political science as well, kind of thing.
Sure.
They do. So I suppose those concepts in and of themselves do communicate something that is quite important to communicate, right? Which is like people who live under capitalism are in some ways constructed as capitalist subjects. Obviously, you have to believe. You have to. Well, I suppose you have to believe, but you have to behave, is what I meant to say. But you have to sort of believe in that behaviour as well.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what he's talking about in ideology, right? Like the thrust of his theories of ideology are that you kind of have to believe in what you're doing, kind of thing.
Sure. Sure.
And it's an active choice to have faith in that kind of thing.
Sure.
But anyway, yeah. It's perhaps important to communicate the idea that the schools or the family or the church or what have you teach you a whole set of norms which are the ones that are allow you to function in contemporary society.
Yeah, he calls it know-how.
Why would they do otherwise?
Yeah, exactly. Well, he calls it know-how. Maybe we've hit upon kind of like why this is, like, as you say, an text, because it's like it explains to you these concepts of ISAs and RSAs, which do kind of like open the third eye, so to speak. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because like, to a certain extent, like you get why he calls the media a state apparatus, because it's like American history obviously is just like rife with collusion, I suppose, between the two. Like, I mean, famously between like the Luces and Henry Luce owned like Time and Life, and the Eisenhower administration, as well as the Dulles brothers, who were like the state for a long time. But also just like with, breaking stories and stuff like that. I mean, there is obviously collusion, but there's also a long history of like it pushing back too. Yeah. So it's kind of like, that battling back and forth and not really mutually exclusive, these two ideas. So maybe that's why it's kind of thought of as like maybe that's entry text.
Yeah. Just as a good.
Yeah. I think you could probably show these
good
ideas.
Introductory text.
Yeah, I think you could show these ideas to like a libertarian, and they'd be like, "You're goddamn right." Like, who wrote that? A Marxist.
And that's how we win them over.
That's how we win them over. That's what I've always been saying, is that libertarians, this isn't like a big crazy take, but it's like libertarians are just anarchists who are just like haven't been given the opportunity. Maybe we have to give them an anarchist to read. A pretentious anarchist.
Just antisocial anarchists.
Antisocial anarchist. Yeah. Antisocial libertarian, social anti-club, anarchist club.
Yeah. But like you are like I mean that's the it's kind of like your point to the crux of the Miliband criticism, right? Like it's not bad to teach those two have those sort of two competing ideas in mind.
Sure. The
RSA and the ISA kind of thing, or rather the sort of like both repressive and I don't know whether Miliband is actually suggesting toward there's both perhaps a repressive and a ideological aspect to what the state does, and a repressive and ideological aspect to what other class actors do, kind of thing. Like supposing that state power and class power are different things, which
Althusser does agree. I suppose he agrees with the fact that power and the apparatuses are separate, right?
Yes.
Which, I suppose not what you were saying.
Yeah.
No, we just interrupted you.
But anyway, and he also does. He makes some quite interesting addendums as well, which kind of complicate his theory to
trips
some
over
extent.
himself.
There's a bit where he's like, we could paint it in such a way that what the ideological state apparatuses is operate purely by deploying sort of like ideological means and purvey ideology, and the repressive state apparatus purely are repressive and use repressive power and force to secure their ends. And then the next paragraph is like, but actually there's a certain extent to which ideological apparatuses deploy force, and there's a certain extent to which state apparatuses are ideological. So there's always this kind of like, here are our big theories, but actually there's always this mixing kind of thing. And I think maybe the only criticism of this is that like if you focus too much on the theoretical names and definitions for all of these things without sort of like it's more important to focus on the messiness than the cleanliness of the theory. You want to look at the sort of messiness of the reality kind of thing. So there's that, and there's also the addendums that he makes, like, whereas like state apparatuses is kind of, you're talking about one unified thing, whereas all the ideological separatuses kind of operate all of their own accord. So it's not kind of like you have these two types of thing, but the ideological ones aren't all actually unified and working toward one end necessarily. They have their own ways of operating, and which is not necessarily
well, many of them are just have to rely on the dictates of the market as well, which makes them not necessarily just at the whims of the state either. So
it's true.
It's true. It's true. I did think it was interesting when he was trying to make the distinction between state apparatuses and state power, he was like, look at 1917, right? I mean, that's when basically the state kind of survived, like, for the most part. At least for the bureaucracy, like, it was just kind of still just more or less the same thing, but the power had shifted to
I'm glad that
ostensibly
you bring up that case kind of thing, because he's really keen to separate state power from the apparatuses kind of thing, which is quite nice actually, because I was talking about like his sort of historical transitions being sort of like gradual messy affairs rather than clean cut things, right? I mean, like to some extent the 1917 revolution in Russia, I mean, it's not even to some extent, like self-evidently is not analogous to the transition from feudalism to capitalism kind of thing. But as a faltered effort to replace one system with the other, perhaps. I appreciate that he makes that distinction, that you could ostensibly change the even if you change the class that has the power of the state, all of the apparatuses of the state remain the same, and then you have to sort of systematically battle with the old apparatuses and create new ones, or to change the old ones to your. I mean, he uses the example of Lenin desiring to remake Soviet education kind of thing to make it sort of non-capitalist and socialist in its outlook. Which comes back to your. I mean, I don't know whether this is good or not, right? Whether because you were talking about like the utopia having ideology in it kind of thing, which is fair enough, but like pre the point where humanity sort of like leaves its prehistoric infancy that we're still in, and sort of like reaches communism.
Hell yeah.
But what? How should we think about that idea that we need to create our own apparatuses of one kind or other, ideological in some ways? Like,
well,
how favourably look on the idea of Lenin and the Soviet Communist Party, like creating ideological apparatuses of its own. I mean, in 1917, you can be like, yeah, that's cool. Whereas by like 1933 or 34 or whatever, the ideological apparatuses of the Soviet Union probably not something that we should be taking as our model for. Like, I don't know.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a difficult.
Ideological apparatus is now function in a sort of like totalitarian way. Do we want to try and reproduce totalitarian apparatuses, or is there a more sort of like egalitarian? I don't know. Education system. What would a socialist education system look like? Is basically what I'm saying. I suppose.
That's a good point.
Something to which we kind of answer. But
I mean,
but by simply drawing an analogy between capitalist education and socialist education, it's not what anybody's doing other than the thought experiment that I'm having in my head right now. But also not something that we should be aiming for.
I also think that kind of just brings me back to tying up a lot of what we've done so far with like. Even just like the Corbyn stuff, right? Where it's like, more so the Meeksons would, where it's like, if we really want to try and consider a transition, again, trying to use all of this information to like actually change things, if we really want to try and consider how a transition would occur between capitalism and socialism, it seems very difficult to do it with just the seizing of the state apparatus and trying to just battle with this huge multi-headed snake, which is not just the state apparatus, but it's also what he calls all these ideological apparatuses, right? And it seems like that's why we saw a lot of these, this is a bit of a misnomer, but like failed transitions to what could maybe have been capitalism, right? Because the social relations just weren't there. So it does seem like, at least using history as our guide, there would have to be some kind of change in social relations before things even can kind of like come close to a permanent change. That's really interesting. Yeah. That's my big theory of the day. And it's one. I'll take credit for that. That was me. Yeah,
I agree.
It's hard to imagine just seizing the American state and being like socialism. There you go, done. That's why we're reading State and Revolution next week.
Yeah. Always promising.
Always promising. Never delivering to our Leninist fans.
I was. A lot of this is premised on the idea of the distinction between the base and the superstructure.
Yes.
Which I thought would be interesting to talk a little bit about.
Sure.
We haven't really touched on it. We sort of gestured toward it in some of our previous episodes.
Yes. I'm getting kind of cold on it. I'll be honest.
Yeah, I mean, Althusser like presents it as being this kind of like central Marxist notion kind of thing. And I find a lot of this really quite funny, because one of the things that I knew about Althusser was that like he kind of thought that he developed this idea of an epistemological break that happened in Marx, where like there was a younger Marx and an older Marx. And now we quite frequently talk about a mature Marx and an immature Marx kind of thing.
Sure.
But he was thinking very, very like a really big schism that happened kind of thing. And it was mostly so that he could reject the in his day the sort of the new and developing school of thought, which was Marxist humanism, and he was sort of like an anti-humanist famously kind of thing. So that's part of the reason why he developed this concept of an epistemological break in Marxist thinking. But that being said, it does kind of feel like lots of his examples are drawn from the early Marx in a lot of ways.
You're right.
I mean, even something like ideology, ideology kind of feels, I mean, this is just reporting what I've sort of heard now kind of thing. So but like ideology, quite prominent in early Marxist writing, in the German ideology, for example, but then not really mentioned very much at all in Capital. And Althusser even says that, like, it's not really a concept used very much in Capital. And Althusser seems to decide that he needs to elucidate a theory of ideology to help Marx out, kind of thing. And there's sort of, I mean, the other way of turning around is like, so why did Marx stop using this term ideology, kind of thing? And similarly, like he puts a lot of value in the idea of the separation of base and superstructure, which again is kind of like an idea associated more with the earlier Marx kind of thing, and isn't so prevalent later on. He makes it this sort of central idea of Marx. He's quite good actually in that I don't know whether it's good or bad from an ease of reading and thinking standpoint. He doesn't easily differentiate between Marx and Marxism, but you have to once you read a little bit closer, every time you see he's talking about Marxism, I suspect the best way to read it would be to see that he's not actually talking about Marx anymore. He's talking about the development of Marx's theory kind of thing. So when he's talking about the state, and he talks about like he refers quite a lot to like Marxist texts of one kind or other, or key Marxist texts. When he's talking about the state, he's probably talking about State and Revolution when he talks about a key Marxist state text kind of thing. And similarly, when he's talking about the difference between base and this is why I keep sort of alluding to him being a crypto-Stalinist, right? Like the distinction between base and superstructure became very prevalent in the ideology of the Soviet Union and in I suppose the writings of Stalin, but also sort of what came to be considered Stalinist theory kind of thing. Basically because the Soviet Union was engaged in this activity of like developing its sort of productive base. All of its direction and thought was sort of at this sort of like economic activity. How do we develop our productive forces? We just need to develop our productive forces, and once we have the productive forces necessary to have communism, we can then have the social relations of communism, kind of thing. Whereas like in the writings of Marx, that distinction is considerably less significant. And I read one criticism of it from our old friend Ellen Mixes Wood. And the basic argument that she makes is that Marx's analysis, although it's kind of like directed at the economic, he always finds behind the economic social relations. I mean, it's bourgeois economics, to use sort of like quite tired language, but or I don't know, like alienating language or whatever. It is the sort of it's the economists who are pro-capitalist, who are and the sociologists to that extent as well, who are most interested in defending capitalism, who are the ones that are also most interested in separating the economic from the social. And the gesture of Marx and Marxism ought to be to show how all economic activity is actually social activity. And Meeks and Wood's criticism is that if you hold to the idea of the base and superstructure, really what you're doing is obscuring or hampering the actual ability to develop theories in that lane, kind of thing. Like you're actually obscuring or making more difficult that work of seeing the social behind the economic, kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. You're making it difficult to parse the granular details.
So yeah. But I mean, I don't like the most egregious criticism to make of base and superstructure is kind of like, if you say that behind the sort of like, but yeah, like Althusser uses this language of like the multiple stories of a building. Like you have the economic foundations of society, and then the various floors of a building are built on top of it, and he names certain of those floors like the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatuses, kind of thing. But one of the problems is if you make the economic base the sort of determining factor, but then we're all forced to live in the superstructure, you do end up with this question of how does the superstructure relate back to the base, kind of thing. Like, how do you change the base? Now, I don't think that's what Althusser, I think he is trying to offer a way out of that. I think his efforts to look at how society reproduces itself, and I suppose I'm just guessing now, maybe you could look at the way the suggestion that society is constantly reproducing itself, and given that society is in this constant activity of reproducing itself, and it's not like once you've transitioned to capitalism it's done, but like there is this constant work going on. If the constant work is still going on, then you can always find ways to interrupt that work of the reproduction of capitalism, and maybe that leads to a way out, kind of thing.
Yeah. Again, I guess you're still just left with like the idea of trying to tackle those apparatuses, though. You put yourself at the top. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, now what? Yeah. Which is funny because, I mean, for someone who definitely like recognizes all of these different aspects of capitalist society as being relatively autonomous, but all working towards a general similar goal, it does seem like making the claim that they all, I guess, have a similar goal that is rooted in kind of like the economic mode. It makes it tricky for him to parse all of those. Like, how autonomous are these things? How much are we able to actually change it? But I mean, I guess that's just structuralism in a nutshell, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay then. You know what I mean? It's like, now what? But yeah. I mean, I think this is definitely like an interesting text to, I suppose, be introduced to structuralism, right? To understand.
I was just about to say, maybe we need to find a better introduction. Maybe we need to find a text that will introduce to structuralism better.
Yeah, well,
I don't know.
I don't know. I think generally just explaining these ideas of the ISAs and RSAs is a very good way of being very broad about a broad theory, if that makes sense. Having said that, these are all more or less notes. And I suppose maybe, though, that's why it is this text that is kind of considered introductory. Yeah,
because you can set it as a weekly reading. Kind of thing,
and pick and choose what you want from it, and not mess with the coherency, such as there is some throughout the entire text. Glad we read it, though. I think it'll be interesting to see what other texts we wind up doing that are similar to it, in the sense of like trying to figure out why these are considered like, I want to become a socialist. What do I read? You know what I mean? I think that's kind of an interesting kind of set of things to study. And to study them as that, and not as like, not state and revolution, exactly. Lenin who? But yes, but just to kind of realize, maybe to understand why these texts are considered so foundational, and then also, and I think also reading things that aren't, trying to figure out why they aren't. But it is an interesting exercise. It was one that I kind of didn't really expect to have to do, which was read something like this and figure out like, what's the big deal? What's the hubbub? Interesting.
Maybe the question of this episode has been, or this reading has been for us, like, what's the big deal about this text kind of
what's
thing.
the big idea?
Which was the problem that I was having to some extent. Like, I was coming from the point of already having read certain things which were critical of it, and then trying desperately to not. I initially I was just like, I'm just going to be thoroughly critical, and then afterwards trying to actually give it its due kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's a good exercise in and of itself, kind of thing. Like, I guess you should always try and give every text or every idea its own space. Try and work out what its internal logic is, what its argument is.
Coming
the
at
only way to test the validity of something is to try and work with it, but with a presumed coherency kind of thing.
Coming at it from that angle, you definitely think of a lot of what is being written as like bong rip takes. Because it's like when you get to the bit about the schools, it's like, yes, you're right. Children do learn how to have a job at schools. You know what I mean? But yeah. All in all, I think, glad we read it. Glad we got it out of the way. And
it's right at the end. There's a little like postscript kind of thing.
Yeah, which I found very refreshing.
Very useful.
Yeah,
because it's at that point that he's like, it actually, that's the only point where he actually sort of talks about class struggle and class conflict, and you're suddenly put in the position, okay, actually, what's really we should be focusing on and be much more interested in is the back and forth of the class conflict kind of thing, and how does that influence the I don't know, the base, the superstructure, the mode of production, in its entirety, kind of thing. But I just felt a bit like, well, why wasn't this in the text?
Yeah, I know.
Like, why wasn't this a text about class struggle?
Yeah.
But I don't know. There you go.
Yeah, I'll read a little bit from that just because it is interesting. He said, that is why the ISAs are not the realization of ideology in general, nor even the conflict-free realization of the ideology of the ruling class. The ideology of the ruling class does not become the ideology not become the ruling ideology by the grace of God, nor even by the virtue of the seizure of state power alone. It is by the installation of ISAs, in which this ideology is realized and realizes itself, that it becomes the ruling ideology. But this installation is not achieved all by itself. On the contrary, it takes stake in a very bitter and continuous class struggle. First against the former ruling classes and their positions in the old and new ISAs, then against the exploited class. And it's like, yeah, exactly what you're saying. It's like, wow, I wish that's what this entire thing was about, because you're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's not, because there is a way in which you can look at this as like, he's just laid this sort of like, you take the sort of like the raw matter of society and you lay this structural sheet over it, and suddenly everything is sort of like conforms to it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas really it's a much more kind of like active historical, political process kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, it's all good. I basically was just going to say that it's like, I think that was the point of the text, and he got a little bit too in his own head, because at the very beginning, he's like, here's my main thesis. He goes on to expound like 10 other theses, right, that he lists, but it's like his main thesis is that, right, coming back to the beginning of the episode, it's like, how are social relations reproduced? And he says it there in the postscript. Yeah. It's like, there you go. But I mean, again, this was probably written for people who are more interested in kind of like philosophy than me, so I understand that. And I also understand that he was writing this as notes, and I also understand that he was writing this from a position as an anarchist. So there you go.
It's a radical theory, but you're sticking to it.
I'm sticking to it. Tune in next week to hear my theories about how Noam Chomsky is actually just a neoliberal.
That would be a radical take.
That would be a radical take.
A hot one, I do not know.
Yeah, there you go.
Nice. All right.
Althusser, we did it. We got through it.
To talk about it.
Boy. I'd like to hear a cut of us going, oh, should we do it? And then us coming out the other end. Oh boy, there we go. We did it. Woof. I don't know. Any parting thoughts on Al?
Not really. No, I don't. I think we've dealt with some sections of the argument, and I think we've tried to overlay our own sort of meta-analysis of what's happening. But I don't know whether he offers much of it. I don't know whether there's much of a coherent arc to it. But to some extent there is, and we haven't necessarily portrayed that fairly, perhaps. So I just want to give him some space.
That's the auxiliary statement.
Come on the show.
Kind of treatment. Come on the show. Defend yourself. Debate me. All right. Well, Yes, there you go. Read it yourself. Let us know what you think.
Or don't.
Yeah. Go ahead and at Dan. Let him know. Send us a DM. Yeah, not sure what we're doing next week. It'll be good, though. It'll be fun. It won't be like this, I would assume, but maybe it will be. You never know.
Well, this has been fun.
This has been fun.
Yeah.
This has been good. It's been fun to do.
All right then. Are we giving up?
Yes. Week late. Happy Thanksgiving, though.
Yeah.
And
Did you have? No, of course. I was just about like, did you have a nice Thanksgiving? I meant to ask you this at the start, but it's a stupid rhetorical question.
Well, I
Not
did.
even a rhetorical question.
It
Did
was
you have
nice.
a nice Thursday on your
nice.
own?
I had a nice Thursday. It was very nice. Ate some food.
Cool.
Yes.
It's our timeline.
Yeah.
It's Frederick Engels' 200th birthday tomorrow.
And also, I'm going to say this. It's Engels' birthday. It's also Dan's birthday. Dan will be turning 21.
Again.
Shoot him all of the nice DMs. Yeah, look at that. Maybe we should read some like Engels. Or something
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
what we should have done. I did have this aspiration. There's an economist, Michael Roberts. At the beginning of the month, he released a book, Engels 200, like
Oh, cool.
Engels' contribution to Marxist thought. Now, I think maybe we're a bit early in our adventure into this subject matter and podcasting in general to have read that book, but I did have the idea of reading this book. But Engels, yeah, someone that deserves more space and more time and more thought. I was reading another introduction to like Marxist economics recently. And discovered that it was basically Engels who was the first person to recognize the significance of political economy. It was also the first person to sort of identify as a communist, I think, before Marx kind of thing. I think also the first person to just recognize the significance of class and the working class in general kind of thing. So I think Engels quite often described as the first Marxist even before Marx kind of thing. To some extent, like an outlier to Marx. Marx's contribution is obviously massive and one that's about shadows. But give Engels his due.
Give him his due, folks. It's interesting.
And a better beard. And a good beard. But he was
fantastic beard.
He was
He was a beard guy.
Yeah.
I mean, move to England, beard guy. You say first person to call himself a communist.
Of Marx and Engels, not in history.
Sure. I'd always kind of heard though that the word communist was kind of made because Marx really wanted there to be a distinction between him and the French socialists.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it was communism is just.
Yeah.
I mean, at that time, and in my usage, I use them interchangeably. I presume. I mean that maybe that should have been something that the listener discovered before now. Like quite often when I'm quite like it's hard, right? I mean, depending who you are and where you come from, those terms relatively toxic. I mean, to you, like even socialism probably quite a toxic term.
Yeah.
Forget communism kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And here less so or more so. And I suppose there's a debate as to whether you should use these terms or give them up.
I think that's a whole episode. I think
it's
a
whole episode in itself. I think my strategy has become like use them but try and disempower them of their significance.
Sure.
Or give them. I mean, it's a quite a ambitious, even sort of narcissistic take.
Yeah.
To be like, me alone is going to be the one person that defines this terminology.
Yeah.
But like socialism, communism, they mean the same thing.
Yeah.
But I think I've heard several explanations as to why like
there's a word communism.
I don't know whether it was defined purely as a sort of German as opposed to French affectation or like piece
I
of
thought it was just him
terminology.
being disappointed.
But it might have been that.
I
did. It's at least one idea why Marx favoured communism over socialism as a term, to distance himself from the French and.
Which, if that's the
lean
case,
towards German.
maybe we should be distancing ourselves from the word communism. But that'll be a whole nother episode.
Yeah, or socialism.
And socialism.
Well, I don't know.
Well, both.
If Marx chose communism over socialism and distanced himself from the French, then we should also distance ourselves from the French.
I'm all for distancing ourselves from the
After
French.
this week.
Listen, after this week, I'm all for
no more
distancing
French
ourselves.
people.
This is an auxiliary statements promise. We will never read another French person on the show.
We'll make no such. Earlier on, I was like, maybe I should read some Foucault. Perhaps, I mean, I feel like we've been on a little quest now. With, I mean, if we've got a series of bigger ideas that we're multiple of our episodes focused around, kind of thing.
Sure.
One of them seems to have become recently this sort of like I don't know how you describe it, like ideology, culture, kind of like, and I feel like we're developing we're sort of developing some idea of how capitalism sort of culturally,
why no revolution?
Ideologically reproduces itself. Yeah. Why no revolution? Exactly. Yeah. I don't know whether maybe we'll take a break from that trajectory next week and think of something else.
We'll watch some Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, happy birthday, Dan, for tomorrow, which will be 6 days ago when it is your birthday.
Happy Thanksgiving for yesterday.
Thank you so much.
Which will be 8 days ago.
Yes. Little late, Dan, I will say. Yes, that was Louis Althusser. What was it called? Ideology and the State. We got through it. We did
Ideology and Ideological State
Apparatuses. Yes. Notes towards an investigation. Nice. This is much like our last week's episode.
Yeah. Part 1, addendum part 2.
Yeah, chapter 3, 1, chapter 4, 2, 1. But yes. It was good. Yes. And there you go.
This has been Auxiliary Statements. I'm Dan.
I'm Jack. We will see you next week, I suppose. The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.